everybody is waiting for the same moment. It is the moment your account starts earning more in a year than you put into it. The year your money finally does more work than you do. That is what people mean when they say compounding kicked in. So I ran it for two people who could not be more different. The first can spare $25 a month, $300 a year, which is the kind of amount people apologize for. In her first year, she puts in $300 and the account earns nothing. By year 5, she puts in $300 and the account earns $93. Still not close. Then year 12 arrives. She puts in $300 and the account earns $331. For the first time, her money did more than she did. Now the second person, he puts in $5,000 a month, $60,000 a year, 200 times what she can manage. Year 5, he adds $60,000 and the account earns $18,000. Year 11, he adds $60,000 and the account earns $58,000. Getting closer. Then year 12 arrives and he adds $60,000 while the account earns $66,000. The same year, not roughly the same. She crossed it holding about $4,700. He crossed it holding $947,000. 200 times the money, 200 times the balance, and the exact same calendar date. So the question everybody asks, which is how much do I need before compounding starts working, has an answer nobody expects. There is no such number. It was never a dollar amount at all. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that works for normal people instead of the kind that sells you something. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that is what you want, hit subscribe. The reason those two dates match is simpler than it looks. The line you are trying to cross is not a fixed amount of money. It is always the same multiple of whatever you happen to be putting in. At a 7% return, that multiple is about 14. She needs 14 times $300, so her line sits at $4,200. He needs 14 times $60,000, so his line sits at $840,000. His target is 200 times bigger. He is also filling it 200 times faster. Those two facts cancel each other out perfectly, so both of them arrive in year 12. Whatever you save moves the target and your speed by the same factor, so it drops out of the equation entirely. I need to correct something I said on this channel because of that, since I am the one who gave you the number. In an earlier video, I called that 14 times figure the threshold and the arithmetic was right. Calling it a minimum was not. A minimum is a fixed bar you have to clear. This one moved down to meet you. Her version of it is $4,200. She gets there just as fast as the man whose version is $840,000. It describes where you are in the process. It is not a gate you are locked outside of. The same thing shows up even with no contributions at all. $100 put in once and left alone becomes $387 after 20 years. $1,000 becomes $38,770 over the same 20 years. Both multiply by the identical factor. The mechanism never checks the size of what you handed it. It only checks how long you left it there. There used to be a real dollar floor, and it is worth knowing why it disappeared. Because most people are still acting like it exists. 20 years ago, small accounts got eaten by fixed costs. Brokerages charged annual maintenance fees, minimum balance fees, and a commission every time you bought anything. Put $50 of annual fees on a $500 balance, and that is 10% a year. A 7% gain turns into a 3% loss. That was a true minimum. Below a few $1,000s, the math genuinely did not work. Then the industry changed. As of this year, opening a standard brokerage account at Fidelity or Schwab costs nothing, carries no annual maintenance fee, and requires no minimum balance. Buying and selling online is free. The cost of the investments themselves collapsed too. An index fund is just a basket holding a slice of every big American company. It charges a small yearly fee for the service. Fidelity's version of that basket costs about $1.50 a year on a $10,000 balance. Some of their funds charge nothing at all. That is what killed the old floor. A fee charged as a percentage takes the same slice from everybody, no matter how big the account is. $100 in that basket pays about a penny a year. $5,000 pays 75 cents. The small investor and the large one keep the same return. A second barrier disappeared around the same time, and this one was even more practical. It used to be that you had to buy a whole share. If a share cost $600 and you had 25, you could not buy anything. Your money just sat there waiting until you had 600, which took 2 years. Money sitting still earns nothing, so those were 2 years of not compounding. Now brokers will sell you a sliver of a share. That same $25 buys a small piece of one and starts working the day it arrives. The barrier people are still worried about got dismantled while they were worrying about it. It is worth pausing on how recent that is. Free trading only became standard across the big brokers in late 2019. The ability to buy a sliver of a share arrived at most of them around the same time. So if you formed your beliefs about investing before about 2020, and most people watching this did, those beliefs were accurate when you formed them, the rules changed underneath them and nobody sends a notice. If the floor is not a balance, what is it? There are two, and neither is the one you were bracing for. The first real floor is debt. Here is the part people miss. Compounding is not only working for you, it also works against you on anything you owe, and it works faster there. Your investments in your credit card are running the same machine. One is pointed at you and one is pointed away from you. What matters is which one spins quicker. The Federal Reserve's most recent quarterly data puts the average rate on credit card accounts carrying interest at 22.15%. Lending Tree's analysis of credit reports puts the average balance among cardholders who carry one at $7,886. Put those two numbers against each other. Carrying that balance costs about $1,747 a year in interest. That same amount invested would earn you about $552. So you are losing roughly $1,200 a year, and you lose it again every year no matter how patient you are. Waiting does not help here. The machine spinning against you is the faster one, so time makes the hole deeper. That is a genuine floor, and it has nothing to do with how much money you have. Someone with $80,000 invested and $8,000 on the card is standing below it. So is someone with $200 to their name. Clearing this floor is not about willpower. It is arithmetic, and the dividing line is about 7%. Where does 7 come from? That is roughly what the American stock market has returned over the long run, once you subtract inflation. The historical data comes from NYU Stern. Every 7% figure in this video is that number. It already has inflation taken out, so it is what your money gains in actual buying power. So any debt charging you more than 7% is beating the best return you can realistically earn. Paying it off is the one move in personal finance that pays a guaranteed return with no bad years and no waiting. Below 7%, the answer flips. A mortgage at 4% is not an emergency, and money aimed at paying it off early is usually better off invested instead. The second real floor is time, and this is the only thing that has a genuine minimum. To see it, follow one single dollar at 7%. That dollar earns money two different ways. It earns a return on the original dollar, which is the boring part, and it earns a return on the money it already earned, which is the part people call compounding. Separating those two is the whole trick. After 5 years, the dollar is worth $1.40. 35 cents came from the original dollar earning its return. Only 5 cents came from earnings piling on earnings. So the famous part is 13% of what happened. After 10 years, the dollar is worth $1.97 and earnings on earnings has climbed to 28%. After 20 years, it is $3.87. For the first time, the money made by past earnings is bigger than the money made by your original dollar. 51%. By 40 years, the dollar is worth almost 15, and 80% of that came from earnings on earnings. So that dramatic curve everyone shows you is real. It just takes about 20 years to become the main thing happening, and no amount of money speeds it up. The person with $1 million and the person with $100 are both waiting the same 20 years. That is the actual gate. It is priced in years and it charges everyone the same. One thing does move it, and it is not your balance, it is the return itself. At 9% real, growth on growth takes over in year 16. 7% pushes it to year 20 and 5% to year 27. Drop to 4% and you are waiting until year 33. A weaker return never raises the dollar minimum because there's no dollar minimum to raise, it just makes the wait longer. That is also the strongest practical argument for keeping your costs near zero. A fee does not reduce your balance so much as it postpones your calendar. There is one place where a small contribution stops being small. Many employers will add money to your retirement account when you add money to it. It is usually described as matching 50 cents for every dollar you put in, up to some limit. That is a 50% return handed to you before the market has done anything at all. Take somebody earning $45,000 who puts in 3% of their pay. That is $112 a month, exactly the kind of amount people dismiss as pointless. With that 50-cent match, $2,025 a year lands in the account instead of $1,350. Over 30 years at 7%, that becomes about $191,000. Without the match, it would have been $127,000. The match alone contributed $63,000, and the person's own money never changed. So the smallest contribution in the room, from the lowest earner in the room, is worth 6 figures over a career. That is not a pep talk. It is what happens when somebody hands you 50 cents on every dollar. Move that same person from 3% of their pay to 6%, and everything doubles. $4,050 a year goes in instead of $2,025. 30 years later, the account holds about $383,000 instead of $191. Their own contribution rose by $112 a month. The result rose by $192,000. A video that stops here would be a nice feeling and a bad plan. $25 a month for 30 years becomes about $28,000. To turn a balance into monthly income, use the standard rule of thumb. You can pull out about 4% of it a year without running dry. On $28,000, that is $94 a month, real money, and nowhere near a retirement. $100 a month for 30 years becomes $113,000, or $378 a month. $500 a month becomes $567,000, which supports about $1,889 a month. The mechanism has no minimum, the outcome absolutely does. Anybody telling you a small amount invested for a long time solves retirement is lying to you, and I am not going to. I want to take apart the most common version of this advice because it usually gets stated dishonestly. You have heard that starting small today beats starting big later. Test it. $100 a month starting now, held for 30 years, produces $113,000. $500 a month starting 10 years from now, held for 20 years, produces $246,000. The person who waited a decade and then saved 5 times as much finished with more than twice as much money. Starting small does not automatically beat saving more later, and anyone who tells you it does has not run the numbers. Now run the version where somebody starts at $100 a month and steps up to $500 at year 10. That is how real careers go, and it produces $310,000. Starting small does not beat saving more later. It stacks with it, and the stack is worth about $64,000 more than waiting. That is the honest case for a small amount. Not that it wins on its own, but that it costs you nothing and adds to everything that comes after. A small balance buys you a second thing, and it never shows up in any of these calculations. At some point, the market will fall 30% while you are holding. Everyone gets one, usually several. The question is what you do in the 8 weeks after it happens. On a $2,000 balance, a 30% drop is $600. On the $200,000 you might be holding 20 years later, the same drop is $60,000. Learning how you personally react is going to cost you something. Learning it at $600 instead of $60,000 is the cheapest tuition available anywhere in finance. And the reaction is expensive. Take somebody putting away $6,000 a year for 30 years. Say a crash pushes them into cash for 2 years and they resume afterward. That single reaction costs about $42,000 by the end. So the small balance is a rehearsal. You are not really building wealth in year 2. You are finding out what kind of investor you are while the answer is still cheap. The cost of waiting has a price tag too, and it is steeper than people expect. Take $100 a month over 30 years. Wait 2 years before starting, and you end with $16,500 less, which is 15% of the outcome. A 5-year delay costs $37,000, a third of it. 10 years of getting ready gives up 57%. Nobody experiences a delay like that as a decision. It feels like a period of getting organized. There is one more lever that matters more than the starting amount, and it barely gets mentioned. $100 a month, held flat for 30 years, gets you $113,000. Now raise that same $100 a month by 3% a year, roughly a normal cost of living increase. It gets you $155,000. 37% more. Entirely from letting the contribution grow with your income instead of freezing it at whatever you could manage on day 1. The amount you start with is close to irrelevant. The direction it moves is not. That is also the easiest of all these levers to actually pull. Nobody has to find an extra $100 in a budget that does not have one. They just have to route the next raise instead of absorbing it. Now let me argue against my own video because there are 3 places this framing can mislead you. The first is that a small balance and a large balance behave identically inside the account, but not identically inside your life. $25 a month is roughly invisible in a household budget. $5,000 a month reflects a set of large permanent decisions about housing, cars, and career. The math treats them the same. Your life does not, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The second is the 20-year timeline. Every number here uses a smooth 7%, and the market has never delivered smooth anything. I ran every 10-year stretch in the last century of American returns. 4 of 91 came out negative, and 9 finished under 3% a year. If one of those decades lands on you, your year 20 arrives later, and nothing about your behavior changes that. Hold the timeline loosely and keep contributing through it, because the contribution is the part you control. The third is a group this video does not serve, and I want to name them rather than let them sit through it. If you are 62 with almost nothing invested, a 20-year gate is not a gate you can walk through. The useful answers for that situation are in the video about what your Social Security is actually worth. They have very little to do with compounding. So here is what to take from all of this. If you have been sitting out because your number felt too small to bother with, the number was never the qualifier. The account is free to open and the fund costs almost nothing. The line you were waiting to reach moves down to meet whatever you can actually do. What you do have to clear is debt above roughly 7%. Because that engine beats yours and always will. And you have to start the clock, because 20 years is the one price nobody negotiates down. So open the account this week and put something in it, whatever something is. If there is a match at work, contribute enough to capture all of it. That is the one place where a small number stops being small. Then raise the contribution whenever your income rises, which is the lever that actually moved the numbers in this video. The amount was never the thing standing between you and compounding. The waiting was. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.